Good day everyone. I'm Vijay Kishore Ashokan. Today, my presentation focuses on DNS cache poisoning attacks and the proposed mitigation approach discussed in the paper. Let's delve into the key points we'll be covering. Table of contents. Initially, we'll be doing comprehensive exploration of DNS, starting with a visual representation to illustrate its significance. Following that, we'll embark on a journey into the backgrounds of DNS, uncovering its myriad use cases and the pivotal role it plays in the modern networking. We'll also delve into the existing defense mechanism implemented to uphold DNS integrity while also addressing the pressing challenges faced by the protocol in today's dynamic cyber landscape. Additionally, we'll scrutinize the body of related research shedding light on the valuable contributions made by the previous studies to mitigate DNS attacks. Moving forward, we'll delve into the intricate workflow of DNS cache poisoning attacks, meticulously examining the various types of port scam and ICMP messages utilized in these malicious exploits. As we transition to the real world scenarios, we will vividly illustrate how DNS attacks unfold and discuss practical implementations accompanied by insightful results obtained across different kernel versions. Finally, we'll engage in a thorough analysis of our findings, meticulously dissecting the implications and drawing actionable conclusions to fortify DNS security measures in the future. Introduction to DNS. DNS, or Domain Name System, is a fundamental component of the Internet that translates human readable domain names into numerical IP addresses. This translation process is crucial for accessing various online resources. The primary purpose of DNS is to facilitate the translation of the domain name such as example.com or linkedin.com into the corresponding IP address which computer uses to communicate with each other over the internet. Without DNS, users would need to remember and input lengthy numerical IP addresses to access websites, which would be impractical and cumbersome. DNS operates in a hierarchical structure with different levels, including top level domains, second level domains, and subdomains. This hierarchy effectively organizes domain names. The key components of DNS includes the following: DNS resolver, DNS servers, and DNS record types. We'll see them in detail. DNS resolver. This is the client-side component responsible for initiating DNS queries on behalf of the users. The resolver sends requests to DNS servers to obtain the IP addresses associated with the domain names. DNS server. DNS server stores and manages DNS records which contains information mapping domain names to IP addresses. There are various types of DNS servers, including authoritative DNS servers, recursive DNS servers, and caching DNS servers. DNS record types. DNS record contains different types of information, including A records, which maps a domain name to an IPv4 address, quad A records, that is, maps a domain name to an IPv6 address, CNAME records, alias records that maps one domain name to another, MX records, which specifies the mail exchange server responsible for receiving email for a domain, NS records that identifies the authoritative name servers for a domain, PTR records, which performs reverse DNS lookup mapping an IP address to a domain name. So here we'll see a pictorial representation of how DNS works. When a user enters a domain name into their web browser, the DNS resolver on their device initiates a DNS query. The resolver first checks its local cache to see if it already has the IP address for the requested domain. If not, it sends a query to the recursive DNS server, which may recursively query other DNS servers until it obtains the IP address. Once the IP address is obtained, it is returned to the resolver, which then forwards it to the user's device, allowing the browser to establish a connection to the desired website. So overall, DNS plays a very crucial role in enabling users to access websites and services on the internet seamlessly. It serves as the backbone of the internet communication by translating the human readable domain name into the numerical IP addresses required for the data transmission. Next, we'll look at the background of how DNS is being employed. So, DNS has been employed in mainly four different things: email authentication, routing security, failover and redundancy, and certificate issuance. Let's start with email authentication. DNS serves as a backbone for protocols like SPF, DKIM, and DMAR. DMAR policies are securely housed within DNS, guiding email receivers on handling authentication failures. Routing security. Moving on to the routing security, DNS doesn't just resolve domain name, it also contributes to mechanisms like BGP root origin validation. By storing the cryptographic keys and certificates in the DNS, we validate the legitimacy of the BGP routes announcement, enhancing overall routing security. Failover and redundancy. Now, let's discuss the failover and redundancy. DNS-based failover solutions are instrumental in ensuring continuous service availability within with the DNS records like A and C name. We seamlessly reroute traffic away from the failed resources, maintaining uninterrupted operations. Finally, the certificate issuance. DNS plays a pivotal role here too. CAA records stored in the DNS empower domain owners to specify which certificate authorities are authorized to issue SSL or TLS certificates. Additionally, DNSSEC adds an extra layer of security by digitally signing DNS records, bolstering the integrity of both DNS data and certificate issuance process. So, DNS cache poisoning. DNS cache poisoning is a type of cyber attack where the attackers manipulate the data stored in the DNS cache of a DNS resolver by injecting false DNS records into the cache. These attackers can redirect legitimate traffic to malicious websites or servers, effectively leading users astray. So, how does this attack unfold? Attacker impersonates the DNS name server, sending a request to a DNS resolver and then forging the reply when the resolver queries a name server. This is possible due to the use of UDP by the DNS server instead of TCP, coupled with a lack of verification for the DNS information. Consequently, when a DNS resolver receives a forged response, it accepts and caches the data uncritically, unable to discern its legitimacy. There are several existing defenses against the DNS cache poisoning attacks. Apart from randomizing ephemeral ports, however, these solutions aren't widely used due to various reasons. DNSSEC, for instance, enhances DNS security by verifying the origin of data, ensuring its integrity. Unfortunately, only a small fraction of popular websites and open resolvers actually implement DNSSEC, limiting its effectiveness. Some major websites like Google, Facebook, Twitter don't even have the necessary DS records for the DNSSEC. Another defense mechanism, known as the 0x20 encoding, adds randomness to domain names by changing the case of letters. While it boosts entropy, it faces compatibility issues and lacks support for many public DNS resolvers. DNS cookie is yet another measure where a secret is exchanged between a resolver and a name server to prevent off path response injection. However, it's only enabled by a small percentage of open resolvers and may face compatibility issues. In summary, while these defenses exist, their limited adoption due to compatibility issues and translation change challenges hinders their widespread effectiveness in mitigating DNS cache poisoning attacks. Now, let's discuss the related works. The off-path DNS cache poisoning attack gained attention in 2008 thanks to Dan Kamingly's work. Initially, randomizing ephemeral port numbers helped thwart attack. However, attackers developed fragmentation attacks to bypass port guessing, though they often relied on assumptions or puppeting on victim resolvers. Port exhaustion attacks also emerged, de-randomizing port numbers by monopolizing available ports, albeit requiring a puppet to function. In 2020, SAT DNS introduced a side channel approach to DNS cache poisoning, but it's slow and time consuming. Other tactics like leveraging domain passing ambiguities or exploiting the IP ID value have also been explored to predict port numbers. Our approach differs by leveraging ICMP as a unique side channel for fast port for scanning, providing an alternative method for DNS cache poisoning. Side channel attacks in the networks have been documented extensively. For instance, some studies have used IP ID counters to probe open ports, while others have utilized stateful firewalls or global challenges ACK counters to infer TCP sequence numbers and hijack TCP connection. Automated tools have also been developed to identify side channels in TCP stacks, uncovering additional vulnerabilities within Linux system. Now, let's discuss the workflow. The attack workflow involves several steps to successfully poison the DNS cache of the resolver. First is identifying the victim resolver on the domain. So here, the attacker first identifies the victim resolver that they intend to target for the cache poisoning attack. The attacker also identifies the domain they want to poison and the corresponding name server associated with the domain. Second, slow down name server. Here, the attackers may slow down the legitimate name servers to prevent them from responding quickly to the victim resolver. Slowing down the name servers gives the attacker more time to execute the attack. Third is the trigger query on the resolver. Here, the attacker initiates a query on the victim resolver to put it in a state where it is willing to accept responses from the name server. This step prepares the resolver to receive and process DNS responses. Fourth, infer the ephemeral ports. Here, the attacker leverages new side channels such as ICMP errors to infer the ephemeral ports used by the resolver for DNS queries. By executing these side channels, the attacker can determine the ephemeral port's number efficiently. Inject rogue responses. Once the ephemeral port is known, the attacker spoofs the name server's IP address and injects rogue responses to the victim resolver. The rogue response contain malicious DNS records and are designed to be accepted and cached by the resolver. Finally, cache poisoning. So here, the rogue response with matching fields arrives before the legitimate response from the name server. The resolver accepts and caches the rogue results. This results in the successful poisoning of the DNS cache on the victim resolver. By following these steps in the workflow model, an attacker can exploit side channels to conduct DNS cache poisoning attack efficiently and effectively, potentially compromising the integrity of the DNS resolution process. Traditional methodologies. UDP-based port scans. UDP-based port scans, a traditional method utilized to determine the status of the UDP ports. These scans involve sending probes to specify destination port numbers and analyzing the response received, such as ICMP ports, unreachable messages which indicates closed ports. One key aspect of the UDP-based port scans is the explicit feedback mechanism provided by the presence or the absence of ICMP response. This feedback allows the attackers to infer the status of the UDP port based on the response received, facilitating the reconnaissance and the vulnerability assessment. Furthermore, the UDP probes are often employed to identify public-facing ephemeral ports. By discovering these ports, the attackers gain insightful insights into the accessibility and the potential vulnerabilities of the UDP services running on the servers. SAT DNS. The SAT DNS technique and the related method represents a variant of the traditional UDP-based port scan, focusing on indirectly inferring the status of the ephemeral ports by leveraging ICMP responses and side channel vulnerabilities in the DNS software. Despite its initial innovation, the vulnerabilities exploited by the SAT DNS have likely been addressed and patched to prevent such attacks from being successful. There is a way to defeat the port source port randomization. An attacker wants to know whether the target has an open port. So, he sends a spoofed UDP message from the authoritative server to the port. The port is open, no ICMP reply is sent, and the rate counter remains unchanged. If the port is inaccessible, then an ICMP reply is sent back to the authoritative server, not to the attacker, and the rate is increased by 1. Although the attacker doesn't see the ICMP response, it has influenced the counter. The counter itself isn't known outside the server, but whether it has hit the rate limit or not can be measured by any outside observer by sending a UDP packet and waiting for a reply. If an ICMP port unreachable reply comes back, the rate limit hasn't been reached. No reply means the rate limit has been met. This leaks one bit of information about the counter to the outside observer, which in the end is enough to reveal the supposed secret information. Concretely, the attack works as follows. The attacker sends a bunch large enough to trigger the rate limiting of probe messages to the target, but with a forged source address of the victim. In the case where there are no open ports in the probed set, the target will send out the same amount of ICMP port unreachable responses back to the victim and trigger the rate limit on outgoing ICMP messages. The attacker can send an additional verification messages from its own address and observe whether an ICMP response comes back or not. If it doesn't, then there was at least one port open in the set and the attacker can divide the set and try again or do a linear scan by inserting the suspected port numbers into the set of known closed ports. Using this approach, the attacker can narrow down to the open ports and try to guess the message IDs until it is successful or gives up, similarly to the originally Kaminsky attack. Proposed approach. The research paper introduced a novel method of conducting port scans using ICMP packets, which are typically error messages and do not elicit explicit response to infer ephemeral port numbers selected for UDP sockets. Side channel discovery. The study uncovers previously known side channel in the Linux network stack al- that allows off-path attackers to leverage ICMP messages to infer ephemeral port numbers, highlighting the subtle interaction among the ICMP, UDP application layers for reconnaissance and potential exploration. ICMP as diagnostic tool. ICMP are traditionally used as a diagnostic tool for network troubleshooting and error reporting. But the research demonstrates how these messages can be repurposed by attackers to gather information about the ephemeral ports and potential exploits vulnerabilities in the DNS resolvers. Impact on DNS transaction. The research shows the ICMP messages can not only be used for port scanning but also to disrupt DNS transaction, indirectly aiding cache poisoning attacks by causing disruptions in the resolution process and potentially facilitating malicious activities. ICMP message types. ICMP messages indicating fragmentation needed are typically sent by the routers to inform the source that the packet size has exceeded the maximum transmission unit of the next hop. This message includes the desired MTU to allow the source to adjust packet sizes accordingly. Redirect. ICMP redirect messages are used by the routers to inform the source host of a better route for the specific destination. This message type helps in optimizing network path and improving routing efficiency by redirecting traffic through more efficient routes. Destination unreachable. ICMP messages with the destination unreachable type are generated by the routers or the host to indicate that the destination is unreachable or that the specified service or the port is not available. This message helps in diagnosing connectivity issues and identifying inaccessible destination. The analysis of DNS attack. There are three types of attacks. We'll explain each in detail in the upcoming slides. Frag needed based public port inference. To understand the public facing ephemeral port scanning, this diagram is the best reference. For an ICMP frag needed attack, the attacker simply sends an ICMP frag needed message with their own IP address. This message includes a UDP header with the guest source port and the destination port of 53. It's crucial to note that this source and the destination IP addresses should be the resolver's IP and the name server's IP respectively. It is important to emphasize that in the desired scenario, the assumption is that the initial UDP packet has already been sent to the name server, prompting the name server to respond with an ICMP frag needed packet. However, in reality, this sequence of the events hasn't occurred yet, and we need to fabricate a scenario where the resolver accepts the ICMP frag packet. Interestingly, some widely used DNS servers like the Unbound and the DNS Mask generate public-facing ephemeral ports, also known as the wildcard sockets. This means that the Linux and the other operating systems are more permissive with these ports, accepting any inner destination IP addresses in an ICMP message as long as the inner source address matches the resolver's IP and the inner source port matches the ephemeral ports. This leniency allows the attackers to trick the resolvers in updating the maximum transmission units for any remote IPs, even those it hasn't communicated with before. In the attacker's prop packets, their own IP address is used to fill the destination IP of the embedded packet. This action effectively lowers the MTUs for the attacker's IP if the guest ephemeral port is correct. To observe the cache change, the attacker sends a verification packet like the ping, triggering a reply from the resolver. By observing if the response is fragmented due to the lowered MTU, the attacker can confirm the success of the attack. However, if the ICMP redirects it for probing, the victim resolver becomes unresponsive as the traffic is redirected to an incorrect gateway IP, potentially leading to the black hole situation. In the essence, public-facing ephemeral port scanning exploits the permissive of the certain DNS softwares to manipulate the resolver's behavior and potentially disrupts its normal operations. Redirect-based public port inference. This topology explains how the attacker manipulates the gateway IP using IPMP redirect packets. As we know, only the gateway can send ICMP redirect packets, and receiving a similar package from the other sources will be disregarded. The operation mechanism is akin to previous topology we discussed. Here, the attacker dispatches an ICMP redirect packet containing an embedded UDP packet. It's crucial to ensure that the spoofed packet reaches the victim and the resolver only processes it through. To confirm whether the cache has been updated, we send a ping and inspect the reply. If the reply is forwarded to the spoofed gateway IP, the objective is achieved. Otherwise, if the attacker receives the ICMP reply, the mission fails. Frag needed based private port inference. In the realm of DNS software such as Bind, the generation of the private-facing ephemeral ports is a common practice. This feature presents a challenge to previously established methods, rendering them ineffective. To adapt to this scenario, an adjustment is required. The inner destination IP address must be set to match the IP of the name server. This ensures that the alterations in the cache state remains contained within the confines of the name server, making them inaccessible to the potential attackers. Interestingly, an alternative method exists for indirectly monitoring these changes. This method capitalizes on the finite number of slots present in the global exception cache. Within the Linux ecosystem, this cache is organized as a hash table accompanied by linked list. Collisions occurs when a multiple IP addresses hash into the same bucket as a name server's IP. By saturating the available slots in the linked list, attackers gain the ability to indirectly monitor alterations in the cache. First, the attacker plants 5 spoofed IPs C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5 in the hash table. Then the attacker sends the another spoofed IP AU. If the four tuples get matched, the respective cache overwrites C1. Then the attacker sends verification packets with 1300, and if the ICMP reply is also 1300 bytes, then the attacker gets to know that the resolver's cache has been updated. The goal is achieved. If the 4 tuple doesn't get matched, the entry is not updated. So when the verification packet is sent of the size 1300 bytes, the ICMP replies gets fragmented since the MTU of the C1 is 1200. With this, the attacker gets to know that the cache entry is not updated and that their goal is not achieved. Conditions for successful attack. To successfully exploit this, certain conditions must be met. C1. C1 must check the port numbers in the embedded UDP packet of an ICMP error before processing it. C2 must cache the MTU or the next hop information. C3 must not ignore the ICMP fragment needed or the ICMP redirect message in the kernel. C4 must not shut down or retransmit the query after receiving the ICMP messages. So here, the Unbound starting from the version 1.5.2 followed a similar path as Bind. However, unlike Bind, Unfold previously utilized the public-facing ports, leaving it vulnerable in both IPv4 and IPv6 on the kernel versions 3.15 to 4.14. This vulnerability persisted due to the storage of the MTU or the redirect information in the kernel, particularly within the timeout-based tree structure. Analysis extended to the other operating system revealed BSD's immunity to these vulnerabilities due to the issue with ICMP frag needed and redirect handling. FreeBSD forwards the ICMP frag needed errors to the application layers without storing PMTU's information, violating RFC 1191 guidelines. Surprisingly, FreeBSD accepts the ICMP redirect packet without verifying the embedded 4 tuple, further compromising its security. To successfully exploit OpenResolver, certain conditions must be met. T1. The rejection of the ICMP errors when the embedded source port is incorrect. T2. The existence of the next hop exception cache. T3. The acceptance of the ICMP errors. T4. The open port status after receiving the ICMP errors. So overall, among the among 1,56,737 backend resolvers IPs, approximately 13.85% are vulnerable, while 37.72 of the 1.84 million front-end resolvers IP are estimated to be vulnerable to due to shared backends. Specifically, 8.9% of the vulnerable populations are susceptible to public-facing port scans. Estimating the vulnerability to private-facing port scans relies on the kernel version data from Nmap with an estimated of 7,788 backend vulnerable. Among public DNS servers, 6 out of the 12 tested were found to be vulnerable, including OpenDNS and Quad9. Evaluation. We tested the fragment needed attack effectiveness in the cache poisoning across various server configuration, network conditions, and the background query traffic levels. The attack involved an attacker hostbook, host MacBook, a victim resolver PC running bind on Ubuntu, and a name server, the AWS. 9 groups of experiments were conducted, starting with an ideal baseline and the attack and progressively introducing different configurations of the network condition. Realistic scenarios were also simulated, including the background query traffic resembling production environment. To maintain the stealthiness, packet rates were limited, and the variations in the packet loss, jitters, and delays were simulated. The packets on the name servers muting the levels and the batch sizes of the attack performance were also evaluated. Results. On average, our attack can succeed within 1.3 to 15.6 minutes, with the tested consideration failed if unsuccessfully after an hour. In the baseline and the packet loss experiment, success was achieved in around 80 seconds, indicating the minimal impact from moderate packet losses. However, in experiments with the delay and the jitter RTT, the attack was affected, potentially leading to the false positive due to packet reordering. Despite this attack, could the our attack despite this our attack could still succeed due to the implemented time gaps to mitigate reordering issues. Name server muting levels significantly impacted our attacks, although less so compared to SAT DNS. Under the same muting level, our attacks was 10 times faster than SAT DNS, primarily due to the faster scan speeds and not requiring iterative props. Discussions and conclusions. Discussion. Discussion on various aspects related to the DNS cache poisoning attacks, side channels, and their implications. Attack surfaces. The researchers conducted an analysis on the attack surfaces, uncovering strong side channels that have existed over a decade in Linux kernels. Vulnerability assessment. The document highlights that about 38% of their open resolvers and 14% of the backend IPs are vulnerable to the identified side channel. This vulnerability extends to popular DNS services such as OpenDNS Quad 9, indicating a widespread impact of the DNS infrastructure security. Experimental validation. Extensive experimental validation was conducted under realistic configurations and the network conditions to demonstrate the reliability and the speed of the attack. Cross-layer implication. The discussion touched upon the cross-layer implication of DNS cache poisoning attack, emphasizing the intersection of the network security, operating the system security, and cross-layer protocols. By exploiting the side channels, the attackers can target vulnerabilities across different layers of the DNS infrastructure. Key finding. The document presents the key findings related to the resurgence of the DNS cache poisoning attack with the side channels highlighting the need of the robust security. Conclusions. So we discovered new ways that the Linux network system can be exploited. We found that the attackers can use ICMP messages to scan the UDP port in a different way than the usual. This affects various DNS softwares like Bind, Unbound, DNS Mask that runs on the Linux. We have shown how these exploits can lead to serious attacks that manipulates DNS cache with the real-world consequences. To stop these attacks, we suggest some strategies like changing socket settings and adding more randomness to the cache. We tested all of this in the real-world scenario to see how it works in practice using the latest bind resolver and home routers. References. The references that I have supported for the development of this presentation are listed below. Thank you for listening to this presentation.